And thank you so much for coming to this important special meeting on a special day that's a little bit dreary out there. So I'm glad we're on Zoom. And I will introduce Greg Woodhams, who is going to tell you all about the election administration study for 2024.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne. So, um, I'm Greg Woodhams. I'm the voter education chair, and I'm a member of the election administration study team. And so before we begin our presentation, we would like to give you a roadmap. First, what we're going to do is talk about the steps and the timeline in our election administration study. And then we'll show you how we prepared this study. So special thanks to the election administration teammates who have contributed: Julie Adolfson, Melanie Bussey, Laura Marcus Mountjoy, and Stan Sexton. So here are the steps in the study. First, members will learn about voter registration role management, and college student voting. And the second thing we'll do is we'll identify timely and relevant proposals. And those two first steps we are going to do today. And then after that, membership, which is you, will consider relevant consensus questions that will be used to develop positions. And then finally, membership will formally adopt positions that enable league advocacy of policies that defend and strengthen election administration. So here's our timeline. In December and this month, in January, we published a number of e-voter primers. And those are online, and they're also on the positions page of the league's website. Thank you, Pat Goodwin, for getting those set up. And then here we are at this January membership meeting. This is an educational presentation of the study materials. This will also be recorded. Today, our presentation is 60 minutes of presentation and 30 minutes for Q&A. Then there will be consensus meetings, and those will take about 90 minutes. There will be 3 consensus meetings. The first is this coming Wednesday at Waldo at 6:30, or next Saturday at the Plaza Branch at 10, or on Tuesday, February the 13th via Zoom at 7 p.m. You only need to attend one of these. And finally, on Saturday, March the 2nd, in accordance with league bylaws, at the Northeast Library, members will vote to accept any proposed positions. So let's talk about consensus meetings a little bit more. These are meetings where members will discuss consensus questions, and you will be exposed to those consensus questions in this presentation. And what happens then in the discussion, a sense of the group emerges. And that sense of the group, a statement of a sense of the group, is used to elaborate positions. And for reference, last year's study had important contributions from members based on members' direct experience with elections. In other words, not all the information that was used to create a position came from the study. It actually, a large part of it, or an important part of it, came from membership's experience and points of view. And again, you only need to attend one consensus meeting. Okay, so let's get into the study. This is the second and final year of the election administration study. The positions adopted from last year's study have enabled advocacy in the study areas of election worker intimidation, election challengers, voter intimidation and arms at the polls, and early voting as a way of defending election administration. This year, our focus is on voter registration role management, and college voters. And inside of voter registration, there are 3 subtopics. One is automatic voter registration. The other is Missouri's historic noncompliance with the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, otherwise known as the NVRA. And then the third subtopic under voter registration is third-party voter registration. And that's where an organization like the League of Women Voters registers voters. And then, like last year, the criteria that we used to elevate an issue as an area of focus were the following. One is national trends in the voting climate that were in some cases or in some states restrictive, as in Missouri, and in other states, they were actually expansive, where we saw relevant and timely legislation, either positive or negative, nationally or in Missouri. And finally, suggestions from interviewees in election administration and faculty at institutions of higher learning. So here's how our work and our presentation is going to be organized. The study material have 6 dimensions. First, terms to know. This is something that we struggled with last year. We're hoping to emphasize this a little bit more this year. Early in our presentations, we identified topic-specific vocabulary. The second dimension is concerns. And what we do is here we identify problems. This year, problems relate to barriers to registering voters and threats to voter registration. Another dimension are the primers, and those are that's work and third-party published information that we've curated. And we've curated those documents. We've chosen them because we think that they are very good at introducing themes to the layperson. Another dimension is existing and proposed legislation, as well as important litigation, as well as model practices. Possible positions were written as examples. And then finally, each topic has consensus questions to be considered by membership at consensus meetings. So now Melanie Bussey will begin our presentation with the topic of voter registration.
Thank you, Greg. My area of focus is voter registration, and I will be addressing automatic voter registration and Missouri's compliance or non-compliance with the National Voting Registration Act. Terms to know. Automatic voter registration, or AVR, is a system in which eligible voters are automatically registered to vote when they provide information to a participating government agency. While a total of 24 states and the District of Columbia have some form of automatic voter registration, Missouri does not. While the League of Women Voters has a history of supporting automatic voter registration, it does not have a stated position that explicitly endorses it. And finally, Missouri has a history of non-compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. The following primers were provided in the eVoter, and I would urge you to go back and review them. The summary automatic voter registration by the National Conference of State Legislatures provides an overview of automatic voter registration, including the Oregon model that was implemented in January of 2016. The case for AVR by Brennan Center for Justice indicates that automatic voter registration would add up to 50 million eligible voters to the rolls, save money, increase accuracy, and improve the security of our elections. MIT Election Data and Science provides benefits and drawbacks to AVR. Benefits include statewide agencies that collect relevant information about potential eligible voters can facilitate the process of registration for voters and election officials. The system would automatically register individuals who may otherwise not register to vote. It bolsters turnout by removing significant barriers for voters, especially for those belonging to racial and age minority groups. And finally, the primer Summary of NVRA Litigation provides a summary of the lawsuit League of Women Voters of Missouri versus Ashcroft. The full settlement agreement was also part of the eVoter article. So current federal law is basically the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also known as the NVRA or the Motor Voter Law, sets forth certain voter registration requirements with respect to elections for federal office. Sections relating to voter registration include Section 5 that requires states offer voter registration opportunities at state motor vehicle agencies. Section 6 that requires states offer voter registration opportunities by mail-in application. And Section 7 requires that states offer voter registration opportunities at certain state and local offices, including public assistance and disability offices. In Missouri, you can register to vote in person by applying at a county clerk's office, at a Department of Motor Vehicles, or at any state agency providing service to the public, like a public library. Missouri also has online registration through the Secretary of State's website. You can either submit an online application or print and mail your application. There are deadlines to the registration. The voter registration form must be postmarked by the fourth Wednesday before the election. There are also problems with using the DMV for registration. In Missouri, during renewal by mail transactions, the voter registration application is not provided at the time the renewal form is sent to the voter or submitted to the DMV, but is mailed to the voter after submission, but only if the voter checks a voter registration box, and the voter is instructed to return it to elections officials rather than the DMV. This practice violates not only Section 5's mandate that the driver's license renewal form serve as a voter registration application, but also the requirement that voter registration be offered simultaneously with the driver's license renewal. So, model legislation. Oregon became the first state to implement AVR in January of 2016. In what is sometimes referred to as the Oregon model, an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but is instead automatically opted into registering. Shortly thereafter, the voter is sent a notification by mail informing them they were registered and advising them that they can opt out of registration by returning the notification. There are several different approaches states have implemented, characterized by the point at which a voter may opt out of being registered to vote. The majority of AVR states use one of two approaches. The first approach is front-end opt-out. With this approach, the customer at a participating agency may choose or decline to register at the point of service. An electronic screen will ask whether the customer would like to register to vote. If they decline, the voter is not registered. The second approach is back-end opt-out. Customers provide information needed to register to vote during their agency transaction. After the transaction occurs, the customer is notified by the agency via a post-transaction mailer that they will be registered to vote unless they respond to the notification and decline. If the customer takes no action, they will be registered to vote. In this approach, registration information is automatically transferred, and customers may choose to decline or affiliate after receiving the post-transaction mailer. It is important to note that some, but not all states, apply the same automated processes to other state designated agencies covered under the NVRA. Proponents of automatic voter registration say, the policy removes barriers to registration for eligible voters, a step toward increasing voter participation. By registering through a routine and necessary transaction such as those at the DMV, voters won't have to worry about registration deadlines or application submissions. Automatic registration can also help with voter registration list maintenance because the process updates existing registrations with current addresses. Precise voter rolls facilitate election accuracy while reducing the use of provisional ballots, a fail-safe voting option when there is a discrepancy in a voter's registration status, but which costs more to process. Some supporters also say automatic voter registration leads to higher voter turnout, although evidence supporting this claim is mixed. Opponents of automatic voter registration say that the government should not tell citizens they must register to vote, particularly in states that provide the opt-out choice by mail after the fact. Furthermore, they question whether opt-out forms that are sent and received through the mail are sufficient to ensure an individual can decline to register. Other key benefits of AVR, as noted in the primers provided in the eVoter. According to a report by the Brennan Center for Justice, automatic voter registration markedly increased the number of voters being registered. These increases were found in states with large and small populations and across party lines. A report from the Center for American Progress projected that if every state adopted the same system as Oregon, more than 22 million new voters across the country would be registered in the first year alone. And in a publication regarding an Oregon's AVR, Demos found that a significant share of individuals who registered through AVR voted. AVR increased the racial and age diversity of Oregon's voters, and AVR increased the income diversity of Oregon's voters. So for some proposed legislation, nationally is the Freedom to Vote Act, a comprehensive voting rights bill that would establish national voting standards. Specifically, the Freedom to Vote Act would enact automatic voter registration for each state. This act was reintroduced by Democrats in July of 2023, and at this time is not really progressing. In Missouri, Donna Applebaum, a Democrat from District 71, has filed House Bill 1686. The bill creates a section titled the Missouri Voter Fraud Prevention Act that creates a statewide system of automatic voter registration. It also designates state agencies to serve as sources for voter registration information. As of January 24th, the bill has been read a second time, but has not been sent to a committee. Identical bills were introduced in 2023 and 2022 and never moved forward. So let's turn to Missouri's history of noncompliance with the NVRA. Since the passage of the NVRA in 1993, the League continues to be a chief defender of the Act, from acting in court to preserve the text and spirit of the law, to advocating on behalf of the law with secretaries of states. Between 2018 and 2020, the League sent letters to Secretary of States in at least 14 states. And you know how many times they were successful? All of them. And one of the states the League was successful in was Missouri, in the case League of Women Voters of Missouri versus Ashcroft. So what brought about the lawsuit? A summary of the lawsuit is found in the article from Demos, League of Women Voters of Missouri versus Ashcroft. And again, the full settlement agreement was provided in the eVoter if you want to go look at it. But in August of 2017, the Missouri Department of Revenue revised their change of address process, effectively eliminating the step through which customers could update their address with the Secretary of State's office or local election authority, a requirement under the Motor Voter Provisions, Section 5 of the National Voter Registration Act. The League of Women Voters Missouri and two other plaintiffs sought relief in advance of the November general election to ensure that no Missouri voter would be ineligible to vote as a result of the defendant's failure to provide these address update services. An order was issued on September 21st, 2018, instructing the state of Missouri to take immediate steps to prevent Missourians from being denied their right to vote in that November's election as a result of the state's failure to comply with federal law. As a result, the Secretary of State's office had to mail 22,404 notices to citizens who changed their mailing address on driver and non-driver licenses with the Department of Revenue between August 1st of 2017 and September 26th, 2018. The settlement also included provisions requiring training of Department of Revenue and Department of Motor Vehicle Office employees, the designation of a Department of Revenue NVRA coordinator responsible for ensuring that the DMV offices and DOR employees carry out their responsibilities of the agreement, and methods of data collection and reporting. The term of the settlement agreement was 2 years from the effective date, so it actually ended in November of 2020. Voter registration possible positions. Missouri should support the establishment of automatic voter registration where an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV or other state agency is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but is instead automatically opted into registering. Voters would no longer have to worry about registration deadlines or application submissions. While the League of Women Voters has been a leader in voting registration efforts around the country and has been instrumental in working toward the passage of the NVRA and the Freedom to Vote Act, the League of Women Voters does not have a stated position that explicitly refers to endorsing automatic voter registration. The League of Women Voters Missouri should remain diligent in ensuring that Missouri is in compliance with the NVRA and that the Missouri Department of Motor Vehicles has incorporated voter registration services into their driver's license application, renewal, and change of address processes. If the DMV is not in compliance, the League of Women Voters Missouri should continue to partner with other like-minded partners or organizations to litigate the failure of the DMV to comply as it has done in the past. Consensus question 1. While the League of Women Voters has been a leader in voting registration efforts around the country and has been instrumental in working toward the passage of the National Voter Registration Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, the League of Women Voters does not have a stated position that explicitly refers to endorsing automatic voter registration. Under automatic voter registration, an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but is instead automatically opted into registering. Should the League of Women Voters specifically endorse automatic voter registration? Yes, no, why, or why not? Consensus question 2A. Should the League of Women Voters support efforts to monitor that Missouri is in compliance with the NVRA and that the Missouri Department of Motor Vehicles has incorporated voter registration services into their driver's license application, renewal, and change of address processes? Yes, no, why, or why not? And finally, question 2B. In the past, the League of Women Voters Missouri ensured that the state of Missouri was compliant with the NVRA, taking action as needed, insisting that the Missouri DMV incorporated voter registration services into driver's license application, renewal, and change of address processes. Question: should the League of Women Voters litigate or take other actions when the state of Missouri and or the DMV fails to comply with the NVRA? Yes, no, why, or why not? I'm going to turn it over to Greg Woodhams now, who will continue with information on third-party voter registration.
Okay, let's talk about third-party voter registration, starting with some terms to know. So third-party voter registration drives are often nonpartisan community efforts that encourage and assist people in registering to vote. While almost all states allow voter registration drives, some, banned them entirely, and a number of states have implemented restrictions that operate to unduly burden those efforts. The League of Women Voters and the NAACP are examples of groups that conduct third-party voter registration drives. Another term to know, core political speech. If you understand this term, you will completely get this section. Core political speech has two important dimensions. It can be more than words, and it can include actions, like registering voters. Restrictions on core political speech have received the highest scrutiny by the courts. That is, it is the type of free speech that the courts are most likely to protect under the First Amendment. In addition to terms to know, existing law to know includes Missouri's House Bill 1878, which restricts the activities of third-party organizations like the League of Women Voters. It was passed in 2022, but enjoined in October 2022, pending a final decision. Also, as I previously noted, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution is relevant to this topic. So now let's talk about concerns. Kansas and Missouri are among a number of states that have imposed restrictions and barriers to third-party organizations like the League of Women Voters and the NAACP that enable voter participation. The barriers include restrictions on registering voters and informing voters about absentee voting. Let's go back to Missouri House Bill 1878, which, among other things, places restrictions on how the League of Women Voters can interact with voters. These restrictions in the bill would prohibit anyone from approaching their fellow citizens to encourage them to apply to vote absentee, prohibit anyone but registered Missouri voters from attempting to register others to vote in Missouri, require any Missouri voter that wants to encourage voter registration to pre-register with the state in advance, and prohibit anyone from compensating others during voter registration efforts. Violation of these provisions are backed by harsh criminal penalties, including the possible loss of the right to vote. And we did have members of the league that ceased volunteering to register to vote when the law was initially passed. This Missouri legislation was similar to proposals that passed in other states, including Florida and Kansas. And when similar restrictive and punitive legislation passed in Kansas, it resulted in the League of Women Voters of Kansas suspending their voter registration activities. The Kansas League did not contest the law in court, but it did write an op-ed piece in the Kansas Reflector from which we have extracted this quote. Quote, "We missed out on directly registering any of them to vote. You might wonder, why didn't the league do its work this year? What could possibly keep these more than 1,300 strong members born out of the suffrage movement from registering voters? The short answer is the law," end quote. After passage of this legislation, the League of Women Voters of Missouri and the NAACP challenged parts of the legislation regarding voter registration and discussing absentee voting. The League relied on the U.S. and Missouri constitutions in challenging the restrictions that House Bill 1878 imposed on third-party voter registration activity. The League's complaint noted that House Bill 1878 targets the League's core political speech by restricting the ability to, quote, "inform, encourage, and assist Missouri voters to engage in the democratic process by registering to vote and applying to vote by absentee ballot." Ultimately, Circuit Judge John Beadham in Jefferson City enjoined the restrictions on voter registration and absentee voting, in large part on the basis of core political speech. Here's how Judge Beadham described how League voter registration and voter advocacy activities can be considered core political speech. Quote, "Engaging and assisting voters in registering to vote or applying to cast an absentee ballot is, quote, the type of interactive communication concerning political change that is appropriately described as core political speech." He further asserted that courts have repeatedly held that voter registration activities constitute core political speech. And he noted the limits that government has in restricting that speech. Quote, at its core, the right to free speech means that government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. If you would like to read more on this topic, the primers we cite here are layman-friendly discussions. One describes how voter registration is considered protected political speech. The other is the League's United States discussion of the litigation and the timeline. There are no League positions that explicitly discuss the League's voter registration efforts. And absent an existing position, here is an example of what a possible position might look like. The League of Women Voters should defend its right to engage and assist voters in registering to vote and participate in the democratic process, and should contest efforts to restrict our voter registration activities. We believe that these pro-voting activities are protected under the United States and Missouri constitutions as core political free speech. So here's consensus question 1. Are the League of Women Voters actions that engage voters and promote voting an expression of political speech that should be protected under the First Amendment? Yes, no, why, or why not? Question number 2. Should the League of Women Voters actively defend, including through litigation, its right to engage voters and promote voting? Yes, no, why, or why not? Now, Laura Marcus Mountjoy will discuss voter registration roll management.
Okay, so we're going to be discussing voter registration lists or voter rolls, purges of voter rolls, the concept of voter caging, and third-party voter registration organizations. Voter registration lists are lists of eligible voters, also referred to as voter rolls. They form the foundation for nearly everything in election administration. They are always changing as new registrants are added to the rolls and existing registrants move, die, or otherwise become ineligible and are thus removed from the rolls. In Missouri, the voter database is maintained by the Secretary of State, but the actual additions and deletions from the database are accomplished by the individual 116 voting election officials in the state. List maintenance. This is the process of adding newly registered voters, removing disqualified voters from rolls, and the Secretary of State and state election officials sharing information to assist in maintenance. The Secretary of State sends information to local officials that it collects from the Department of Corrections for felony conviction records, the Department of Health and Senior Services for death records, the Department of Revenue or the DMV records, and the National Change of Address Program to document voter moves. While there was a time that Missouri belonged to ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which sent 7 different reports to local officials that we'll discuss later, this is currently the only information that the Secretary of State supplies to assist local officials in list maintenance. Local officials can do their own list maintenance by reviewing obituaries, canvassing their registered voters, and when voters send it, change of address information. Only 2 of the 116 local election officials are election boards in Kansas City and St. Louis, which have large staffs. The remainder usually have 2 or 3 employees to do all the work of the county clerks, including elections and list maintenance. Purging rolls is important. Voters who die, move from the jurisdiction, or are convicted of a felony should be removed from the rolls. But there are rules governing when and if voters who don't vote can be removed or purged from the rolls. Given the misinformation about the claimed inaccuracy of elections and the activism spawned by such claims by political parties and partisan organizations, the practice of voter caging has developed to allow multiple challenges to the registration of individual voters. Voters identified as unfriendly or unfavorable to a candidate or an issue are sent registered letters, which, if returned undelivered, result in challenges to such voters for not maintaining an address within the jurisdiction. In the past 5 years, some states have engaged in illegal purges, and other states have implemented purge rules that are barred by federal election law. Purge rates increased nationally after 2008. The 2013 Shelby versus Holder decision removed pre-clearance protections, leading to higher purge rates in covered states. Federal protections against improper purges are reliant on executive branch vigilance. Protections fell after 2016. Activist groups are pressuring administrators and legislatures to conduct more aggressive purges. Purges have disenfranchised voters based on faulty data in Georgia, Texas, and Arkansas. Purges have removed voters from rolls based on inactivity after only one missed election cycle, as in Ohio. Voter list maintenance doesn't always comply with federal election laws. Voting groups are selectively targeted. Voters are unaware that they've been removed from rolls. Voter registrations are removed based on faulty data relied upon for purges. Some new and proposed state legislation ignore federal protections regarding notice and discrimination. Here are some examples of the use of faulty data. Texas purged rolls assuming that a Hispanic surname suggested the voter was unregistered or illegal. Crosscheck, a third-party voter list maintenance organization that preceded ERIC, was abandoned because of both frequent errors in voter data and breaches of security, something that never happened with ERIC, which had strong, not weak, match of voter names and addresses. In Texas, in 2019, the Secretary of State created a list of 100,000 suspected non-citizens based on faulty data. Use of the list was successfully challenged in court. Ultimately, only 80 people were found to be ineligible. In Virginia, error rates as high as 17% were found in a 2013 purge of 40,000 voters using faulty data from Crosscheck, a system then administered by the Kansas Secretary of State. According to a 2016 analysis, minorities were more likely than white voters to be flagged for removal in Crosscheck. Weak matches mean that the chances that the person identified as actually ineligible were too low to be trusted. For example, a voter whose date of birth and last 4 digits of their Social Security number that matches a dead person's record would be a weak match. On an average day, over 902,000 people share the same birthday. Out of 119 people, there is a 50% chance that 2 of them will have the same last 4 digits in their Social Security number. Voter registrations are removed based on weak matches. On these grounds, a living Texas voter and Air Force veteran named James Harris Jr. was flagged for removal because he shared information with an Arkansan, James Harris, who had died in 1996. According to one analysis, more than 68,000 of the 80,000 voters identified as possibly dead were weak matches. Purging on the basis of inactivity targets lower income voters, targets voters of color, and response rates to pre-purge notices is as low as 10%. In Missouri, proposed SB 1025 would mandate the removal of a voter's name from the list of registered voters if the voter fails, 1, to respond to a notice sent to their address, and 2, has not engaged in voter activity during 2 general elections. The bill does not require informing the voter that they've been removed from the list. In this event, the voter would likely not discover removal until they showed up at the polls to vote, and then they must rely on their ability to cast a provisional ballot. The Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act in 1993, and the Help America Vote Act of 2002 have provisions that protect registered voters from having their registrations purged or removed from the voter rolls in their state jurisdictions. The Voting Rights Act in 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voting and voter registration roll management. The National Voter Registration Act in 1993, in addition to ensuring every eligible citizen has the opportunity to register to vote through the Department of Motor Vehicles, the law provides that list maintenance must be uniform, non-discriminatory, and in accordance with the Voting Rights Act. It also prohibits systematic voter purges, those programs that remove groups of voters all at once, within 90 days of a federal election. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, the NVRA, specifically prohibits removing registrants from the voter register list solely on the basis of a failure to vote. The Help America Vote Act of 2002, HAVA, requires states to create statewide voter registration databases with unique identifiers for registered voters. The law also requires states to attempt to verify the validity of information submitted by voter registration applicants. HAVA also ensures that certain voters, including those who do not appear on poll books, are permitted to vote provisional ballots at minimum. The Missouri Revised Statutes. This refers to the Missouri Registered Voter Database. Additions and removals of voters from the database are made by the 116 individual election officials. Only vigilance by the league or other voting groups can hold state and local election officials accountable for compliance with federal law, and thus from impermissible voter purges. In 2017, Indiana attempted to purge voters without providing notice to the voter, as required by federal law. The court sided with LWV Indiana. Possible positions. Voter registration maintenance should be uniform and non-discriminatory. Voters should be provided with public and individualized notice prior to purging or removal from voter registration lists. Possible position. Voter registrations cannot be removed solely on the basis of inactivity. Question 1A. Per the NVRA, voter registrations cannot be removed solely on the basis of inactivity. In 28 states, non-voting is not a basis for removal. Should the League of Women Voters oppose legislation and practices that remove registrations solely on the basis of inactivity? Yes, no, why, or why not? Question 1B. The Voting Rights Act prohibits discriminatory practices in voter registration list management. Should political parties be allowed to use caging and purging methods, often geographically targeted, to remove registered voters from the voter registration rolls? Yes, no, why, or why not? Question 2. Some states have passed laws that do not meet federal notice standards to protect registered voters from having their registrations purged or removed from the voter rolls in their state jurisdictions. Should voters be provided with public and individualized notice prior to purging or removal from voter registration lists? Yes, no, why, or why not? Now, Stan Sexton will discuss third-party organization assistance in voter roll management. Stan, are you unmuted?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Earlier in this presentation, we mentioned ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, as an example of a third-party organization that assists election officials in maintaining voter rolls. ERIC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization created by and composed of state election officials from around the United States. It was founded in 2012, is funded and governed by states that choose to join. ERIC has provided member states 40 million voter record updates and identified 60 million eligible voters who are eligible but unregistered. If registered, these voters would swell the number of registered voters from 168.3 million in 2020 to over 225 million, a 35% increase. Third-party organizations exist to assist state and local officials in maintaining voter rolls. Most Missouri county clerks have only 2 or 3 employees who have a myriad of other duties besides conducting elections and maintaining their voter rolls for their jurisdiction. 40 million people move every year in the United States. 61 million people in the U.S. die annually. In Missouri, in 2020, over 73,000 Missourians died and over 41,000 inmates were incarcerated. These statistics have a huge effect on voter roll maintenance. Clearly, the more help election officials get, the more accurate the voter rolls can be maintained. Missouri belonged to ERIC for 5 years, but withdrew in March of 2020. Now let's discuss what benefit Missouri obtained from belonging to ERIC. ERIC provided the Secretary of State of Missouri with 4 reports that were in turn provided to local officials. There was a cross-state movers report, which identifies voters who appear to have moved from one ERIC state to another using the voter registration and motor vehicle data. Then you got the in-state mover report, which identified voters who appear to have moved within the state using that same information. There was a duplicate report, which identified voters with duplicate registrations in the same state using voter registration data. And there was the deceased report, which identified voters who have died using the voter registration data and the Social Security death database, known as the Limited Access Death Master File. This vastly eliminated the burden on local election officials to conduct maintenance. Now, ERIC also provided 3 additional reports, which helped local officials surveil voting for illegality and wrongful participation. Eligible but unregistered report. This identified individuals who appeared to be eligible, but who are not yet registered by matching voter registration data and motor vehicle data. Now, remember this point. We in Missouri obtained a report that identified eligible but unregistered voters. Number 2, there was the National Change of Address report, which identified voters who had moved using official data ERIC licenses from the U.S. Postal Service that isn't available to other secretaries of state. And then 3rd, there was the voter participation report. After each federal general election, states can request reports identifying potential illegal voting activity. Voters who may have cast ballots in more than one state or more than one ballot in the same state, or who have voted on behalf of a deceased voter. Missouri's withdrawal from ERIC has deprived Missouri election officials of these 7 tailored reports to assist those officials in maintaining accurate rolls. And understand this, that there are currently no viable alternatives to ERIC. There are databases called Eagle AI, VoteRef, Omega for America, Memorandum of Understanding between states, but none of these have the sophisticated matching software to compare member data to obtain strong matches. The goal of the first three projects I just mentioned is to provide citizen activists with voter lists to encourage them to do their own list maintenance to generate voter eligibility and challenges. And some of these are actually backed by political operatives like Cleta Mitchell, Mike Lindell, and others. Now, the withdrawal has caused Missouri to abandon totally its outreach to register eligible but unregistered voters. During its membership in ERIC, to maintain accuracy of its voter rolls, Missouri was able to identify over 21,700 deceased voters, over 18,000 in-state duplicate registrations, and 368,000 in-state mover reports, and over 383,000 cross-state mover reports. Indeed, in 2020, Missouri discovered that one couple in St. Charles, Missouri, had voted twice, once in Missouri and once by mail ballot in Florida. We no longer have that capability to identify such. Now, Ashcroft withdrew from ERIC because while he issued a press release and a letter sent to ERIC stating his reasons for withdrawing, in an interview he stated he came to the realization that ERIC's operations, including its focus on voter registration, raised concerns about partisanship. Namely, he didn't want to register eligible but non-registered voters like 8 other Republican state secretaries of state after conferring with the Heritage Foundation at a conference in February of 2023. Now, recently, and we're talking about within the last week, the state auditor has released a report which states the Office of the Secretary of State terminated its membership in ERIC, a multi-state election services cooperative, without fully evaluating the benefits received from the membership, consulting key stakeholders, or having plans to fully replace the benefits received from membership. As a result, the Secretary of State and local election authorities will have less assurance that the voter rolls of the state are reliable and will have less useful and timely information for updating voter registration lists. As the state auditor office attempted to evaluate the efficacy of ERIC membership, the Secretary of State officials refused to provide reports from ERIC containing potentially duplicate or ineligible voter registrations, which then caused the auditor to receive them directly from ERIC. So, where does that leave us? Voter registration roll management, there's a possible position suggested by this data. Number 3, outreach efforts should be made to register eligible but unregistered voters. Possible position number 4, maximum assistance, including the use of third-party organizations like ERIC, should be provided by the Secretary of State to local election officials to maintain the accuracy of voter rolls. Data from third-party organizations should be based on strong matches and be tested for accuracy prior to use, with an objective of minimizing disenfranchising eligible voters. ERIC tested its software for 5 years between 2012 and 2017 before they went online, and have not had any instance of unreliable data. So consensus questions that we might consider are, number 3, although no federal election law requires it, some states through ERIC implemented efforts to contact eligible but unregistered voters to register to vote. Should Missouri affirmatively implement an outreach program to register eligible but unregistered voters? Yes, no, or why not? Consensus question 4. From 2017 to 2023, Missouri used ERIC as a third-party organization to assist state election officials in maintaining the accuracy of voter rolls, but since leaving ERIC no longer has such assistance. Should Missouri rejoin ERIC or join another third-party organization like ERIC to assist in local election officials in maintaining the accuracy of their voter rolls? Yes, no, why, or why not? And then finally, question number 5. In several states, purges using weak matches incorrectly identified voters as ineligible, which resulted in their elimination from voter rolls. Should data from third-party organizations used in voter registration list maintenance be tested for accuracy prior to use with an objective of minimizing disenfranchisement of eligible voters? Yes, no, why, or why not? Now, Judy Adolphson will discuss college student voting.
Thank you, Stan. So historically, 18 to 24-year-olds have the lowest voter turnout numbers in the nation. The good news is that in 2020, the national student voting rate was 66%, a remarkable 14-point increase from 2016, where the national turnout for all voters was 67%. And in 2020, the rate of registered students who voted hit 80%. Sadly, many states, such as Missouri, have enacted laws which present significant barriers to sustaining these gains in student voter participation. We'll talk about these barriers and what we as an organization might do to mitigate them. First, some definitions. College students are anyone 18 to 25 years old attending any post-secondary educational program. And on a personal note, which sort of drove my interest in this part of our study, is that all 4 of my boys attended post-secondary programs in Missouri, from Metropolitan Community College to Truman State University and UMKC Law School. Okay, now jurisdiction refers to both location and authority. And the election authority, Kansas City has an election board, while in less populated counties, elections are administered by the county clerk's office. Polling place or venue is where a vote is cast. In early voting, locations are designated by the election authority, and on election day, locations are pre-designated by the election authority. Kansas City has flexible locations, but in more rural areas such as Cass County, you have to vote in a specific location based on your address. Absentee voting includes in-person early voting and absentee voting by mail. No excuse absentee voting. During the 2 weeks before an election, you may vote a no excuse absentee ballot in person at a location designated by the election authority. If you have a valid excuse, up to 6 weeks prior to an election, you can absentee vote early in a designated location. And these excuses include if you have incapacity or confinement due to illness or physical disability, or expect to be absent on election day, or if you're among the following groups: an election worker, first responder, healthcare worker, or member of law enforcement, prevented by religious beliefs from going to the polls on election day, incarcerated but haven't lost the right to vote, an active duty military or close family member living with them, or a Missouri citizen living outside the U.S. Now, student ID refers to photo ID issued by a school. So what is strict voter ID law? Well, in Missouri, as a result of House Bill 1878 in 2022, voters must present a Missouri driver's license or a Missouri non-driver ID from the Department of Motor Vehicles that has not expired before the last general election, or a non-expired military ID, or a non-expired U.S. passport. If a voter doesn't have one of these on election day, they can go back home and get it and come back before the polls close, or they can vote a provisional blue ballot. If the provisional ballot signature matches the signature on file with the election authority, then the vote will count. We'll talk more about voter ID impacts on college students in a minute. So with these definitions in mind, let's list 6 concerns which may disenfranchise college voters. We'll look at all of these in more detail. First, getting a photo ID at the Missouri DMV is difficult and costly. The free photo ID is a non-driver ID, and so students would have to surrender their out-of-state license so they can no longer legally drive. There also may be some insurance and tax consequences for the student or their parents. Second, where or how to register can be difficult depending on each student's situation. Third, absentee voting by mail has its own difficulties. Your vote may not count if you sign in the wrong place on the envelope or make some other clerical error. Also, absentee ballots need to be notarized, certainly a likely challenge for college students. Fourth, deciding on where to vote, when to vote, early in person or on election day can be challenging. Efforts are underway to close or move polling locations, and that may also impact students. More on that in a minute. Fifth, in our research, we found students are understandably intimidated by the voting process, and we'll discuss this further as well. And sixth, during our interviews, it became clear that some faculty and staff have felt pressure to not engage in political discourse or dialogue. So elaborating on the fourth concern about polling places, the efforts to suppress the college vote include this example in Texas. There's proposed legislation to remove polling places on campuses. This type of legislation is being supported by political strategist Cleta Mitchell, who said, "What are these college campus locations? What is this young people effort that they do? They basically put the polling place next to the student dorm so they just have to roll out of bed and vote and then go back to bed." Now, we'll explore some of the information we found, the primers that you can read for a deeper dive in our journey towards consensus. We split up the primers in 2 groups. The first group includes information about 3 student outreach programs and what makes them successful. First is a 1-pager from the League of Women Voters US, which recommends identifying partner schools, establishing contact with students, which may work best through a faculty or staff member or a program area at the school, and building a mutually empowering relationship. The second primer is the Missouri State University model, which emphasizes having a passionate faculty member to oversee students developing a strong student-led program with peer-to-peer interactions and the League of Women Voters playing a supportive role. More about this exemplary program on the next slide. And the third primer introduces the 4 campuses of the Metropolitan Community College, who utilize a campus life and leadership model. This program includes faculty, student engagement managers working with the League of Women Voters Kansas City and other nonprofit organizations to provide voter education, registration workshops, simulated voting activities, and other civic engagement opportunities for the students. The Missouri State University model really stands out, and we encourage you to read Dr. Susan Pacheco's 9-page document on Pause to the Polls. Here's an excerpt from one of the students. It also is intimidating for college students to feel confident in the voting process because the voting process is not readily taught in many curriculums. This is why voting initiatives like Pause to the Polls are so important in helping to educate about the voting process. So we found that what is necessary for successful student engagement in the voting process is a sustained faculty commitment, a peer-to-peer effort that is student-led, a thoughtful curriculum, and having the League of Women Voters in a continuous supporting role. As I mentioned, we split the primers into 2 groups. The first that we just reviewed included model programs that engage the student voter. The second group of primers listed here focuses on guides to help students make a plan to successfully register and vote. Next, we'll explore current and pending legislation applicable to college voters. First, the Help America Vote Act, which you've heard about already, HAVA of 2002. Under HAVA, grants are awarded to schools to encourage student participation as poll workers and foster student interest in the election process. Since 2003, over $4.2 billion in HAVA funds have been awarded. Another law we looked at was the Higher Education Act of 1965, which requires schools to make a good faith effort to distribute a male voter registration form to each student enrolled in a degree or certificate program and physically in attendance at the university, and to make such forms widely available to students. And from an April 2022 letter from the U.S. Department of Education to all schools, post-secondary institutions play a critical role in supporting our democratic process and ensuring that all students have access to resources to engage in our electoral process. In other words, the HEA ties the federal student aid program to the school's efforts to encourage students to register and vote. And finally, President Biden's Executive Order 14010, which in part says, it is our duty to ensure that registering to vote and the act of voting be made simple and easy for all those eligible to do so. So, some proposed legislation includes the Freedom to Vote Act, which will keep polls on campuses, and Missouri House Bills 2379 and just introduced 2538, which would allow high school and college students in Missouri to use student ID to vote. So now, let's talk about some practical recommendations for you to consider. To develop these recommendations, we spoke with the Kansas City Election Board, the Cass County Clerk and his staff, and the Missouri Secretary of State's Program Manager for Go Vote Missouri. We also had productive discussions with people in various academic settings, and here's a list of the people we interviewed from various schools. We were very fortunate to get practical boots on the ground perspectives from all of them. As I mentioned previously, we identified these 4 elements that led to success for engaging college voters in the electoral process. We recommend programs like Pause to the Polls program at Missouri State University and Campus Life and Leadership program at MCC to include the League of Women Voters playing a key supporting role. I've laid out the concerns and barriers, and we've gone over some possible recommendations to mitigate them. Now let's explore possible positions for your consideration. Possible positions that the League of Women Voters of Kansas City should identify and support campus resources that disseminate voting information to students, including information required under NVRA, HAVA, and other federal legislation. Number 2, oppose ID requirements that disenfranchise students, including those that impose financial penalties and disallow the use of college IDs and out-of-state driver's license. Also, the League of Women Voters Kansas City should, number 3, oppose absentee voting restrictions that disenfranchise registered voters because of clerical error, notarization burdens, and the inefficiency of the Postal Service by imposing requirements on when ballots are received at the election authority rather than when postmarked. And number 4, encourage election authorities to have polling places on or adjacent to college campuses. Now, let's go over some consensus questions for you to consider. Question number 1. Do you believe a significant number of college students hesitate to vote because they lack experience, confidence, and knowledge on the process? Yes, no, why, or why not? Dr. Susan Pacheco of Missouri State University invited members of the League of Women Voters to conduct a voting simulation activity in her class. She asserted this demonstrated how the relatively small proportion of people who vote in the U.S. make important decisions for all citizens. Question number 2. Should the League of Women Voters Kansas City further develop partnerships and interactions with campus organizations? Yes, no, why, or why not? Missouri's House Bill 1878 disallows student IDs to vote. Of the 10 states outside of Missouri with strict voter ID laws, only 3 disallow student IDs as an acceptable form of photo identification. Question 3A. Do strict voter ID laws, including those which disallow college IDs, unnecessarily disenfranchise voters, including college voters? Yes, no, why, or why not? From the League of Women Voters US. While supporters argue that voter photo ID laws are necessary to prevent voter fraud and ensure the integrity of elections, reality tells a different story. Not only do these measures disproportionately impact Black, Native, elderly, and student voters, but they also fail to effectively address any real issues related to election integrity. Question 3B. Should students be allowed to use valid college ID to vote? Yes, no, why, or why not? And finally, given what we know about the absentee voter process in Missouri, consider question number 4. Does the Missouri absentee voter process disenfranchise college voters? Yes, no, why, or why not? Well, that does it for me. Thank you for your time today. Back to you, Greg.
Okay, great. So I wish I could say congratulations, you've completed the study, but I can't because the next phase is going to be the one of the 3 consensus meetings that you should attend. But now let's give some time to question and answer. And Anne, if you could help me out, and I'm going to quit sharing my screen here so that we see the gallery and identify anybody that's got their hand up for a question.
Yeah, I would be happy to. I would be happy to. All right, Elizabeth Darr. You're on mute.
Sorry. I'll start again. Thank you, Greg. That was a really, really lovely presentation, and I'm just rolling in information, not all of which I understood exactly. I'll just ask one question going back to the Oregon model. I think it's one thing to basically have automatic voter registration, but I wonder if Oregon's experience is that it increases the number of people voting, and if so, by what percentage?
Melanie, why don't you take that one and unmute Melanie?
Elizabeth, what I recall, the Brennan Sitter for Justice article that was part of one of the primers gives some more information about how the effect of the Oregon model, and it has improved registration. And I think they allege that it hasn't made a difference in voter turnout. But there are several different camps there. Some say it doesn't necessarily affect voter turnout, depending on who you talk to.
Okay, fair enough.
But I would tell you to go back, because I have a hard time retaining all this information in my head. But I would urge you to go back to the primer and look to see what it says.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Donna has her hand up.
Yes, it's interesting to me. I can remember when we did the movie, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, that was put out several years ago. And back then they were giving Eric a bad time because they were really thinking that people were using it to do the week matches, because you do have people that can have the same birthday. You do have people, like you said, had the same last 4 digits in their social security. So I don't know if something's changed or what on that, but I think it's key that we have whatever group we recommend has strong matches rather than weak matches if you're going to do poll maintenance and such. So it might be a phrase we want to add, strong match rather than the weak match. And then my notes are not good, but this was early on when one of our positions, Greg, what did you talk about? What presentation?
So my presentation involved third-party voter registration. In other words, the league's efforts in registering voters.
Right. And on that, one of the positions, you left out absentee voting, and I think that maybe we need to have absentee voting. Not only being able to register to vote, but also to talk about absentee voting. And I know some people worry that maybe candidates are going into nursing homes and getting all those people to vote. But for us, that was one of the scariest things when this law came out, or directive from Ashcroft, that you couldn't even mention, you couldn't educate about absentee voting, you couldn't do anything. So I think on that one, that position, I ask you to look to include absentee voting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Wonderful.
Reva has her hand up, and then Linda Neal.
And I'm just going to say something to that, Donna, because we went, we do Avila every year for voter registration, and a lot of those students are out of state. And at that point, they would have to vote out of state, so we couldn't register them. So I got around because I think the directive was we couldn't talk about absentee ballots. So I just didn't say the word absentee ballot. And I just told the parents to find out how their child, their student, could vote. So I really did talk about it, even though I didn't talk about absentee ballot, because I thought, well, if that's what the word is they're using, I'm just not going to use it. But my question was also about Eric. You mentioned and this also may have to do with what Donna was talking about, is that you said something about Eric or a similar organization, and that concerns me because they might find an organization that is actually really partisan to them. And so I feel like we need to put some kind of restrictions on that other organization. Otherwise, they might just find an organization that they like that does all the things they're doing now.
Okay. So noted, one of the things going back, since we did have the questions about that, Reva, your question about strong matches, weak matches are well defined. It's hard to find a definition on strong matches. And what we did is, in I think the proposed position or the consensus question, we made a reference to the need to test any sort of third-party data. And that, in effect, that will determine whether or not you have strong matches or not. You can't, in other words, you define whether or not you have a strong match or a weak match system, not before the fact or not based on judgment or how you think it might work, but rather on what actually happens when you do the audit. So that was what we included there. But note, those are noted, and I hope you bring those up at the consensus meeting.
Linda Neal.
Yes, early in the presentation, there was the language that League of Women Voters, maybe nationally or Missouri, I'm not sure which, advocated or worked for or supported automatic voter registration, but had not officially taken a position in support of that. And I'm wondering why that was. Are there reasons to not support it, or was it just a matter of wanting to poll its members before it took an official position?
That's a great question. Usually there is not in order to have a position, you need to do a study. And so usually when there isn't a position, it's because the study wasn't there. The other thing is the body of most league positions, and there is a fairly large body, it was crafted before 2016. And before 2016, it was generally agreed by all parts of the political spectrum that voting was a good thing. Post 2016, that is no longer universally agreed. So let me put it this way: most of the positions were written in a pre-2016 world.
And I would just like to add to that for Linda's information. Sometimes it's just a basic principle like Greg's talking about. And the league supports it because it's just a basic principle that we believe voting is good. So you need to be registered to do that. And we in Missouri did a study on early voting, because in Missouri you have to show me. But South Carolina, back when, their board decided it just because it was a basic principle. They didn't have to do a study on it. So that's just past history.
Judy Ann has a question.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Great presentation. All of you. It's really strong and thought-provoking and informational. It's fantastic. And so for that, in the chat, Christine and Janice, and I will add, I too would love to know if this will be available for us and where we might be able to find it.
Judy, always the great media question. Yes, is the short answer. In fact, Pat Goodwin has been so helpful in setting up on the position page information about the study. And we have on that position page, all of the primers that have been posted, and now post this presentation, we will be posting the recording of this presentation as well as the deck on the positions page.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I don't see any more hands up.
Okay, fantastic. So closing remarks here is that take a look at the calendar, the league calendar, as well as the position page, because in the position page, we also have listed when the consensus meetings are. And again, the consensus meetings, this group, our team, we were absolutely amazed and pleased at the quality of the discussion in the consensus meetings last year. The comment was there was so much wisdom in the room, and part of it is because this group has so many people that works in elections and has a very good election knowledge, and a lot of the information that eventually became positions came from membership that came in those consensus meetings. So please show up at one of them and you can have your voice heard.
Thank you, Greg. I want to reflect and agree with what's in the chat, which is that this was wonderful work by your whole team. And so thank you to the team. Thank you for your leadership, Greg. And thank you to everyone who came and listened and asked such good questions. And we'll see you at the consensus meetings in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.